The first time I heard the word widow in relation to myself, it wasn't a word at all, but a silence. It was the silence that filled the sterile, beige-walled office after the colonel, a man with eyes the color of a winter sky and a voice sanded smooth by a career of delivering catastrophe, stopped speaking. He had used all the right words, the ones from the script they must teach them at whatever school it is where they learn to dismantle a person's life with bureaucratic precision. Regret to inform you, ultimate sacrifice, grateful nation, they were words that should have been seismic, that should have shaken the very foundations of the earth. But they didn't. They just hung in the air-conditioned air, weightless and meaningless. It was only when he slid a packet of papers across the polished wooden desk, his fingers tapping on a line of text, and said, as his widow, "You'll find the relevant forms in section 3, that the world finally cracked open. Widow. The word was a stone, cold and final, dropped into the still pond of my soul, and the ripples would never, ever cease. I looked down at my hands, clenched so tightly in my lap that the knuckles were bone-white, and I stared at the simple, platinum wedding band on my finger. And a thought, clear and terrible, rose from the wreckage. No. This is wrong. I became a widow months ago. I've been one for a long, long time. You're just making it official now. You see, the man I buried, the man they honored with a 21-gun salute and a folded flag, was a ghost long before his heart stopped beating. The man I married was named Jack, and he was made of sunlight and solid ground. He promised me forever on an October afternoon so perfect it felt like God had painted it just for us. The oak trees in the park were a blaze of crimson and gold, and the leaves crunched satisfyingly under our feet as we walked, his hand warm and certain in mine. He wasn't in uniform that day, he was just Jack, in a soft, gray sweater that made his eyes look like the sky after a storm. He stopped me right there, under a canopy of fiery branches, and took both my hands. He didn't get down on one knee, that wasn't his style. He stood before me, his gaze so steady and true I felt I could lean on it. Eleanor, he'd said, and my name on his lips was a vow in itself. I don't have a fancy speech. All I have is this. I promise you my life. I promise you my heart. I promise to be your shelter and your adventure, for every single day that I have breath in my body. Until the very last one. I had cried, of course, tears of pure, uncomplicated joy, and thrown my arms around his neck, whispering yes, yes, 1,000 times yes into the skin of his throat. I believed him with every fiber of my being. I believed in the covenant of his touch, the sanctity of his promise. I thought until the very last one was a poetic flourish, a distant horizon we would march towards together, hand in hand, our hair gray and our steps slow. I was a fool. A hopeful, love-struck fool. I didn't understand that the army had its own promise, one written in oaths and regulations, and it always, always collected its debt. My profession is cartography. I am a mapmaker. My entire world, before Jack, was one of lines, symbols, and legends. I took the wild, untamable, glorious chaos of the world, the jagged peaks of mountains, the serpentine paths of rivers, the sprawling, messy clusters of cities, and I rendered them into order. I created meaning from the meaningless. On a blank sheet of paper, I could build a world you could navigate. A dotted line was a trail you could follow. A cluster of green was a forest you could trust to be there. A blue thread was a river that would always flow to the sea. It was a profession built on trust, the trust that the representation was true to the reality. For a prestigious publishing house, I crafted beautiful, intricate maps for travel atlases and history books. I loved the ritual of it, the smell of the paper, the weight of my favorite drafting pen, the precise click of my compass. I suppose, in my heart, I believed I could map a life with Jack the same way. I thought our love was a fixed, immutable landmark, a celestial pole around which all other things would revolve. I was about to learn that there are some terrains that are unmappable. There are some journeys for which no compass can be made. The first deployment order came like a thunderclap on a clear day. It was a year into our marriage, a year of building a life that felt as sturdy and real as the IKEA bookshelves we'd assembled together, laughing and cursing at the hieroglyphic instructions. Our apartment was a sanctuary of us, his army boots by the door next to my muddy gardening clogs, his dog-eared Tom Clancy novels on the nightstand beside my sprawling historical fiction paperbacks. We had our rituals. Sunday morning pancakes, a ridiculous affair where we'd compete to create the most outlandish animal shapes. His elephant was always lopsided, with a droopy trunk, and it never failed to make me snort laugh. I was learning the music of his life, the way he whistled off-key in the shower, the way he always saved the last bite of his dessert for me, a habit born from having 3 older brothers and having to fight for seconds. I was also learning the strange, new vocabulary of being a soldier's wife, the acronyms that peppered his speech like a secret code, the way plans were always written in pencil, the subtle shift in his posture from relaxed husband to disciplined soldier when his phone rang with a number from the base. We knew the deployment was coming. It was a shadow that had trailed us since our first date, a when, not an if. But knowing a storm is coming and feeling the first lash of rain on your skin are 2 entirely different things. The day he told me, he came home and didn't even call out my name. I was in the kitchen, making his favorite grilled cheese sandwich, the way he liked it, with a thin slice of tomato inside. I heard the door open and close, and then, nothing. No footsteps. I came out, spatula in hand, and found him standing in the middle of our living room, still in his uniform, his duffel bag at his feet. He was just standing there, staring at our wedding photo on the wall, and his face was a landscape of a war I hadn't yet seen. "It's time, Ellie," he said, his voice flat, stripped of all its usual warmth. My heart didn't break, it simply evacuated my chest, leaving a hollow, echoing cavern behind. I remember the sound the spatula made when it hit the terracotta tile floor. A sharp, final clatter. The pre-deployment period was a surreal, frantic dreamscape. Our small apartment was suddenly overrun with the grim logistics of potential death. We had to condense his life, his presence, his essence, into 2 large, green duffel bags that smelled of canvas and gloom. There were shopping trips for things I never thought I'd have to buy for my husband, high-tech moisture-wicking socks, a headlamp, a multi-tool that looked like it could survive a nuclear blast. But the worst was the paperwork. We spent an afternoon in a JAG office that was so clean and quiet it felt sacrilegious. A young lieutenant, who couldn't have been more than 25, walked us through documents that felt like they were written in a foreign language of dread. "In the event of your incapacitation," he'd say, his voice calm and rehearsed. "In the event of your death," Jack sat beside me, stoic and solid, nodding as if they were discussing the weather. I held his hand under the table, my grip so fierce I'm surprised I didn't break his fingers. His hand was warm and steady. Always steady. They were planning for his death as if it were a supply chain issue, a contingency to be managed. I felt like I was going to be sick. I was signing papers that gave me permission to bury my husband. I was 26 years old. The goodbye was a public dissection of a private heartbreak. It wasn't a tender, tearful moment in the privacy of our home. It was a spectacle on a vast, windswept tarmac at 4 in the morning. The air was bitingly cold, thick with the smell of jet fuel and despair. Hundreds of us, wives, husbands, parents, children, huddled together under the harsh, industrial lights, a collective of brave faces crumbling at the edges. A little girl next to me, no older than 4, clutched a sign with wobbly letters, "Come home soon, Daddy." Her faith was a knife in my heart. I held onto the front of Jack's ACU jacket, my fists balled in the rough, digital patterned fabric, burying my face in his chest, trying to inhale him, to memorize the scent of his skin underneath the starch and boot polish. "It's just 12 months, Ellie," he murmured into my hair, his voice low and for my ears only. 365 days. I'll write to you every single one. I'll call whenever I can. It'll fly by. You'll see. You'll be so busy with your maps, you won't even notice I'm gone. Promise? I whispered, the word a child's plea, a desperate incantation. He pulled back just enough to cup my face in his hands. His eyes, usually so full of light, were now dark and serious. "I promise. I am coming back to you. This," he said, his thumb stroking my wedding band, "this is the only mission that truly matters. You are my home base. You are my coordinates. Then he kissed me, a kiss that tasted of salt and promises and a future I could no longer see. He shouldered his duffel bag, gave me one last, long look, and then turned and walked away, merging into the river of camouflage marching up the ramp into the gaping maw of the C-17. The plane was a monstrous, gray beast, and it was swallowing my husband whole. The ramp began to close with a hydraulic whine, a final, metallic scream that felt like the universe itself was being severed. I stood there, rooted to the spot, long after the plane had taxied away, long after its lights had vanished into the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky, long after all the other families had drifted back to their cars, their own private sorrows held close. I stood until a woman with kind, tired eyes and a face that had seen too many of these goodbyes, put a gentle hand on my arm. "Come on, sweetie," she said softly. "Let's get you home. The waiting is the hardest part." She was wrong. So terribly wrong. The waiting was a special kind of agony, a constant, low-grade fever of anxiety. But it wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was the subtle, insidious theft that began that very day. The hardest part was that first goodbye, because it was the moment the army truly, irrevocably, began to take him from me. Not in a single, catastrophic event, but in a slow, deliberate erosion. It was the beginning of a long, slow funeral that would last for years. My work, my beloved, orderly cartography, became both my refuge and my prison. I would sit at my large, wooden drafting table in the corner of our silent apartment, the warm pool of light from my lamp a pathetic substitute for the sun of his presence. I was supposedly working on a detailed, large-scale map of the Balkan Peninsula. But my focus was in tatters. The contour lines I drew began to look like the ridgelines of mountains in Afghanistan, a country whose geography was becoming more familiar to me than my own hometown. Every river I carefully inked in a cool, blue wash felt like a moat separating me from him. I'd find myself staring at the blank spaces on the map, the areas marked uninhabited or topography uncertain, and a cold dread would wrap around my heart. Was he there? Was he in one of those voids, a place I could not chart, could not understand, could not reach? His emails were a lifeline, but one that was frayed and unreliable. They would arrive in clumps, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single day, filling my inbox with a fleeting, false sense of connection, followed by a silence that could stretch for a week, then 2. They were masterpieces of omission. He wrote about the dust, a fine, talcum powder-like substance that got into everything, even the seals on the Ziploc bags. He wrote about the mind-numbing heat, the way the sun felt like a physical weight on your shoulders. He wrote about the terrible, bitter coffee they brewed in giant vats, and the bizarre, MRE desserts that tasted like sweetened cardboard. He gave the guys in his unit funny nicknames: Sully, who snored like a chainsaw; Doc, who could patch up anything from a bullet wound to a broken heart; Preacher, who was always trying to save their souls. He asked endless questions about home. How was our cat, Gizmo? Had he finally stopped attacking the curtains? How was my map of the Scottish Highlands coming along? Had the azaleas we'd planted by the front steps finally bloomed? He was painting a picture of a difficult, but almost Boy Scout-like camping trip. He never, ever wrote about the fear. He never wrote about the sounds that woke him at night. He never wrote about the things he saw, the things he had to do. Reading his emails was like listening to a beautiful piece of music with every other note missing. I had the melody of his love, but the harmony of his daily life, the context, the truth of it, was a gaping silence. Our phone calls were even more torturous. They were crackly, broken things, his voice sometimes fading in and out, a ghost on the line. There was always a half-second delay, a disorienting lag that made our conversation feel stilted and unreal. And they were almost always cut short. In the middle of me telling him about a funny thing that happened at the grocery store, I'd hear a sharp, "Gotta go, Ellie. Love you," and then the line would go dead, leaving me with the dial tone buzzing in my ear like an angry insect. I would be left clutching the phone, a torrent of words dammed up in my throat, the echo of his rushed "I love you" ringing in the profound silence of our empty apartment. My entire emotional existence became dictated by the whims of a satellite connection over a war zone. I was a cartographer, an expert in navigation, and I was utterly, hopelessly lost. My own life had become an uncharted sea, and I was adrift. The first real crack in the foundation of us, the first time I felt the cold draft of the coming storm, was during his mid-tour leave. He was coming home for 2 glorious, impossible weeks. I was giddy with a hope that felt almost manic. I cleaned the apartment from top to bottom, I stocked the fridge with all his favorite beers and foods, I bought new, soft sheets for our bed. I must have tried on half my wardrobe, standing in front of the mirror, critiquing every outfit, wanting everything to be perfect. The homecoming at the airport was a scene of such heightened emotion it felt like a movie. The families gathered in a designated area, a sea of handmade signs and nervous energy. When the soldiers finally marched in, a solid block of camouflage and serious, tired faces, a collective cry went up, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. I scanned the rows of nearly identical men, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. And then I found him. Our eyes met across the crowded terminal, and for a split second, it was just us. He broke his stoic expression for a fleeting, genuine smile, and it was like the sun had finally broken through a year of clouds. But when I finally got to hug him, to really feel his body against mine, something was off. He was thinner, harder, all taut muscle and sinew. He held me so tightly it was almost painful, but it wasn't the warm, enveloping hug of a husband coming home to his wife. It was the grip of a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. On the drive home, he was quiet. He didn't ask questions or chatter excitedly. He just stared out the passenger window at the passing strip malls and traffic lights as if he were an anthropologist studying a strange and baffling civilization. He was home, in our apartment, surrounded by our things, but he wasn't home. He was a visitor, a tourist in his own life. The first night, I woke to the bed shaking. He was in the throes of a nightmare, his body rigid, sweat plastering his t-shirt to his back. He was muttering, low and urgent, words I couldn't quite make out. No, get down, watch the roof. I reached for him, my hand on his shoulder, saying his name softly. Jack? Honey, you're dreaming. You're safe. You're home. He erupted. He didn't just flinch, he threw himself away from my touch, rolling out of bed and landing in a crouch on the floor, his eyes wide, wild, and completely unseeing. For one terrifying, heart-stopping second, he looked at me as if I were a stranger, a threat. Then, just as quickly, his eyes focused, and the horror in them was replaced by a shame so profound it was worse than the fear. Ellie. God. I'm so sorry, he gasped, crawling back into bed and pulling me to him, his heart hammering against my ear. Just a bad dream. Sorry. But he wouldn't, or couldn't, tell me what the dream was about. A wall, transparent but impenetrable, had been erected between us. He was physically present, but a vital part of him was still over there, in the dust and the danger, and I had no visa to that country. We tried to slip back into normalcy. We went to a backyard barbecue at a friend's house. It was a perfect summer day, all laughter and the smell of charcoal and burgers. People were happy to see him, clapping him on the back, welcoming him home. He smiled, he nodded, he made the right noises, but his eyes were constantly moving, scanning the perimeter of the yard, assessing the neighbors, cataloging the exits. Then a car backfired a few streets over. It was a loud, sharp pop. To everyone else, it was a minor nuisance. To Jack, it was a trigger. I saw his whole body tense. His paper plate, loaded with potato salad and a hamburger, flew from his hands. In one fluid, terrifying motion, he dropped into a low crouch, his arms coming up as if he were holding a rifle that wasn't there. The chatter and laughter died instantly. A dozen conversations halted mid-sentence. All eyes were on my husband, crouched in the grass like a predator, his face a mask of pure, animal instinct. The silence was deafening. He slowly straightened up, his face flushing a deep, mortified red. He didn't look at anyone. He just brushed the grass from his knees, muttered, "Excuse me," and walked straight into the house. I stood there, frozen, surrounded by the wreckage of his plate of food and the stunned silence of our friends. I felt a hot wave of shame wash over me, not for him, never for him, but for my own helplessness. I didn't know this language. I didn't have a map for this terrain. The man who had promised me forever was standing 20 feet away, but he was in a different universe. The 2 weeks of leave passed in a blur of strained conversations and forced routines. We went to see a movie, but he couldn't sit through it. The darkness, the surround sound, the sudden explosions on screen, it was all too much. He grew increasingly agitated, his knee bouncing up and down, until he finally whispered, "I need some air," and left halfway through. We tried to have a romantic, candlelit dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant, but he spent the whole time with his back to the wall, his eyes constantly flicking to the door every time it opened. The easy, comfortable silence we used to share, the kind that felt like a warm blanket, was now a cold, yawning chasm filled with everything we weren't saying. The night before he had to leave again, we lay in bed, a foot of space between us, both of us pretending to be asleep. The distance between our bodies felt wider than the ocean he was about to cross. "Are you okay?" I finally whispered into the darkness, the question feeling as inadequate as a bandage on a gaping wound. "I'm fine, Ellie," he said, his voice tight. It was the standard soldier's response. A catch-all phrase that could mean anything from "I'm a little tired" to "I'm dying inside." "You don't seem fine," I pressed gently, my heart aching. He was silent for so long I thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, he spoke, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "It's just hard to switch back. This," he gestured vaguely in the dark, encompassing our bedroom, our home, our safe, suburban life, all this quiet. The safety. It feels loud. The quiet is the loudest thing I've ever heard. His quiet was my entire world. His loud was a war zone. We were living in inverted realities, our senses calibrated to different definitions of peace and danger. The goodbye the next day was 1,000 times worse than the first. This time, I wasn't just saying goodbye to my husband, I was saying goodbye to the fragile hope that he would come back to me whole. I was kissing a ghost who was about to return to the land of the living dead, and I was terrified of what would be left of him when he finally came home for good. The second half of the deployment was a deeper, darker descent. The emails became less frequent, more clipped and distant. The phone calls were strained, filled with longer and longer pauses. The connection was fraying. I threw myself into my work with a desperate fervor, creating maps of stunning, obsessive detail, trying to anchor myself to a reality that felt like it was dissolving around me. I started mapping our town, our street, our very apartment, drawing the furniture to scale, trying to create a record of a world that was slipping through my fingers. I was learning a brutal new form of cartography, the geography of absence. I was mapping the shape of the hole he had left behind. When he finally came home for good, when his enlistment was up and he was a free man, there was a collective, audible sigh of relief from our families and friends. The ordeal was over. The hero was home. Now life could truly begin. But a homecoming is not an ending, it is the beginning of a different, more insidious kind of war, one fought in the quiet spaces of a home, with no clear enemy and no victory in sight. He was out of the army. He got a good job as a security consultant, a logical transition for his skills. We used his saved-up pay and a small inheritance from my grandmother to make a down payment on a little house with a wide porch and a big backyard, the kind of house you see in commercials for family life. We were playing house, but the players were damaged, their scripts rewritten by trauma. The man who came back to me, the one who now wore khakis and polo shirts instead of camouflage, was a pale imitation of the man who had left. The laughter that used to come so easily, the laughter that could light up a room, was now a rare and strained event, like a sunbeam breaking through a permanently overcast sky. The light in his summer sky eyes had been banked, smothered under layers of something I couldn't name. He was jumpy, irritable, and emotionally distant. The nightmares were a nightly occurrence. He'd often end up on the porch at 3 a.m, sitting in a rocking chair, just staring into the dark woods at the edge of our property, a silent, lonely sentry guarding against threats only he could perceive. I tried everything I could think of. I suggested therapy, gently, cautiously. Maybe it would help to talk to someone, honey. Someone who understands what you've been through. His reaction was instant and defensive. I'm not crazy, Ellie, he'd snap, his voice like a whip. I don't need some shrink poking around in my head. I just need time. Time to readjust. So, I gave him time. I practiced the patience of a saint. I became an expert in walking on eggshells. I learned not to approach him from behind. I learned to announce my presence in a room with a soft cough or by humming. I stopped wearing perfume because the sudden scent sometimes startled him. I became a cartographer of his internal minefields, carefully mapping the invisible boundaries, learning where I could step lightly and where I should not tread at all. I was trying to navigate the ruins of the man I loved, with no compass and no map. My own work began to suffer terribly. How could I possibly concentrate on the gentle slope of a valley or the serene meandering of a river on a page when my own home felt like a fortress under a constant, silent siege? The symbols on my maps began to feel like grotesque lies. A swath of green no longer represented a peaceful forest, it was potential cover for a sniper. A blue line wasn't a life-giving river, it was a tactical obstacle to be forded under fire. My profession, my beautiful, ordered, logical world, had been poisoned by the chaos he had brought home with him. The very tools I used to create understanding were now tools of paranoia. We were living in a gulf of silence so vast I felt I could shout and never hear an echo. We could go days, sometimes a full week, without having a conversation that went deeper than "What do you want for dinner?" or "Did you pay the electric bill?" We talked about the surface of life. We did not talk about the war. We did not talk about the chasm that had opened up in our king-sized bed, a no-man's land we were both afraid to cross. We did not talk about the chilling truth that the man I had married, the one who made lopsided elephant pancakes, seemed to have been left behind in the desert, and this haunted, hollowed-out stranger had come back wearing his face, speaking with his voice. The strain began to manifest in small, heartbreaking ways that were like 1,000 paper cuts. He forgot our anniversary. The man who once wrote me a love letter every single month for the first year we were apart forgot the day he stood under an oak tree and promised me his life. When I tentatively mentioned it the next day, his face went through a rapid series of emotions, confusion, then dawning horror, then a gut-wrenching wave of shame. Ellie. God. I'm so sorry. I don't. With everything going on, he trailed off, unable to finish. I told him it was okay, that it didn't matter. But it did matter. It was another piece of our shared history, another brick in the foundation of us, that had crumbled to dust. I felt so profoundly, terrifyingly alone. I couldn't talk to my friends. Their husbands came home from their office jobs and talked about frustrating coworkers or exciting projects. My husband came home and sat in a silence so heavy it had its own gravity. I couldn't talk to my family. My mother would say, "Just give him time, dear. He's been through a lot." They didn't understand that time wasn't a medicine, it was a corrosive. It wasn't healing the wounds, it was allowing the infection to fester. I was married to a soldier who had promised me forever, but the war had taken him, and I was left as a caretaker for a veteran of a conflict I hadn't fought, mourning a man who was still, technically, sitting right beside me on the couch. This, I understand now with the brutal clarity of hindsight, was the true beginning of my grief. This was the long, slow, excruciating goodbye that no one prepares you for. It wasn't the single, catastrophic moment of a chaplain at the door. It was the death by 1,000 cuts. It was the loss of shared laughter, of easy intimacy, of the future we had painted together in such vibrant colors. Every time he flinched away from my touch, every time he retreated behind the distant look in his eyes, every silent meal where the only sound was the scraping of forks, was a small funeral. I was grieving the loss of my husband while his heart was still beating, while his lungs still drew air. I was a widow in waiting, performing the rites of mourning for a man who was still, technically, alive. The climax, the moment the slow, creeping grief solidified into a sharp, unignorable, and final reality, did not happen on a distant battlefield. It happened on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. It was overcast, I remember, a flat, gray sky that promised nothing. I was working from home, bent over a new project, a map of a fictional, fantasy world, a place I was creating from scratch, a land with no wars, no soldiers, no loss. It was my escape. Jack had been even quieter than usual the past few days, a deep, unsettling stillness having settled over him. I had learned to read the subtle shifts in the barometric pressure of his soul, and a Category 5 hurricane was brewing behind his calm eyes. I'd asked him if he wanted to go for a walk with me, to get out of the house, to feel the rain in the air. He'd just shaken his head, a barely perceptible movement, his gaze fixed on some point far beyond the living room window. I went back to my desk, the scratch of my pen the only sound in the heavy silence. An hour or so later, I heard the front door open and close. I assumed he'd changed his mind, that he'd gone for that walk by himself to clear his head. I felt a tiny, fragile flicker of hope. Maybe he was trying. Maybe this was a step. Another hour passed. Then another. The flicker of hope began to sputter and die, replaced by a low, thrumming anxiety that started in the pit of my stomach and spread outwards, making my fingers tingle. I called his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. And again. The robotic female voice, "The subscriber you are trying to reach," became a taunt. I called his office. They hadn't seen or heard from him. I called his friend, Mike, another former soldier. Mike hadn't heard from him either. The anxiety was now a full-blown, cold-clawed panic. I told myself I was overreacting. He was a grown man. He'd turned his phone off. He needed space. But every instinct, every nerve ending in my body, was screaming that something was terribly, terribly wrong. I was just about to call the police, my hand shaking so badly I could barely punch the numbers, when my own phone rang. It was an unknown number with a local area code. I snatched it up, my heart in my throat. "Jack?" A woman's voice, calm and professionally neutral, answered. "Is this Eleanor Evans?" "Yes," I said, the word a strangled whisper. "This is Sergeant Mills from the state police." "We have your husband, ma'am." The room swam. I gripped the edge of my desk to keep from falling. "Is he okay? Was there an accident?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, a beat of silence that was more terrifying than any words. "He's physically unharmed, ma'am. We found him on the old highway bridge. He was in a state of extreme distress. We've brought him in for his own safety. He's being evaluated by a crisis counselor now." The words "old highway bridge" detonated in my brain. It was a high, desolate span over a deep, rocky ravine, a place known for its grim reputation. A place people went when they saw no other way out. The meaning of it, the horrific, final intention behind it, crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't gone for a walk. He had gone to the edge. He had stood on the precipice and looked down. The world narrowed to a single, piercing point of understanding. My husband, the man I loved, had tried to leave me. I drove to the police station in a blind haze, my vision tunneling, the familiar streets looking alien and menacing. They led me to a small, windowless room that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Jack was sitting on a hard, plastic chair, his shoulders hunched, his head buried in his hands. He looked so small, so broken. He looked up when I entered, and the look in his eyes will be seared into my memory until the day I die. It was a look of such profound, bottomless shame and despair that it stole the air from my lungs. It was the look of a man who was utterly, hopelessly lost, and who knew it. "I'm sorry, Ellie," he whispered, his voice shredded, raw. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't, the noise in my head, it just wouldn't stop. It was so loud." I went to him and knelt on the cold linoleum floor, taking his icy hands in mine. "What noise, Jack?" I asked, my own voice trembling. "Tell me. Please, for God's sake, let me in. Let me help you carry it." He shook his head, a slow, weary motion of utter defeat. "You can't. You shouldn't have to. It's dark in here, Ellie. It's dirty. I didn't want to bring it home to you. I tried to lock it away, I tried so hard, but the lock is broken." He looked at me, and his eyes were those of a terrified child, trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. "I promised you forever." I meant it. But I don't know how to live in this forever. I'm just so tired. In that moment, in that bleak, fluorescent-lit room, the last vestige of the man I had married seemed to dissolve, leaving only the raw, excruciatingly wounded core of him. The army hadn't just taken his peace of mind, it had taken his hope. It had taken his belief in a future. It had taken the very will of the man who had stood before me on our wedding day and promised me a lifetime. The man who had promised me forever was gone, and in his place was a man for whom the present moment was an unbearable, crushing weight. That night was our true nadir. It was our rock bottom. But it was also, paradoxically, the beginning of our long, arduous fight back. It was the crisis that finally broke through his denial. We finally got him the help he so desperately needed. Real, intensive therapy with a psychologist who specialized in combat trauma. Group sessions with other veterans who spoke the same silent language of pain. Medication to quiet the noise in his head, to give the therapy a fighting chance. It was a long, hard, painful road, with switchbacks and setbacks. There were days when the darkness won, days he couldn't get out of bed, days the anger would erupt like a volcano. But we were fighting together. For the first time since he'd come home, we were a team again, united against a common enemy, the invisible wounds that had nearly claimed him. For a few fragile, precious years, we found a tenuous peace. It wasn't the paradise we'd dreamed of, but it was a life. He learned to manage his demons, to recognize the triggers, to use the tools his therapist gave him. I learned to be his partner in the fight, not his caretaker or his wary roommate. We found a new, slower rhythm, a new version of us that was scarred and battered, but still standing, still fighting. We even dared to hope again, tentatively, like plants pushing through cracked concrete. We talked about maybe, one day, if he felt stable enough, trying to have a child. We planted a vegetable garden in the backyard, and I loved watching him care for the tomato plants, his big, gentle hands carefully tying them to their stakes. I started a new series of maps, this time of entirely fictional, utopian islands and peaceful kingdoms, places where no wars were ever fought, and no soldiers were ever lost. It was my own form of therapy, my act of rebellion against the darkness. But the body, as I would learn, keeps its own brutal, meticulous score. The years of relentless stress, the hypervigilance that had his nervous system constantly screaming, the physiological toll of living for years in a state of fight or flight, it all demanded a final, terrible payment. The cancer was swift, merciless, and utterly ruthless. It started in his pancreas, a silent, insidious invader that had been biding its time. By the time he complained of the back pain, the fatigue, the jaundice, it was a wildfire. Aggressive. Inoperable. Stage 4. The words in the oncologist's office were hammers, smashing our fragile, hard-won peace to splinters. They talked about timelines, about palliative care, about quality of life. They were drawing a new map for us, and its only destination was a cliff edge. I remember sitting in that familiar sterile room, holding Jack's thin hand, listening to the doctor lay out a battle plan that was destined for certain defeat. And I looked at my husband, and I saw not the fear I expected, but a strange, weary, almost peaceful acceptance. It was as if his body, the very vessel that had carried him through war and back, had simply decided it had fought its last battle. It was surrendering. The last few months were a different kind of deployment, the final mission. My objective was his comfort. My battlefield was our home, which we slowly transformed into a hospice room. The familiar smells of our life were replaced by the scent of antiseptic and morphine. I learned skills I never wanted to know, how to administer a subcutaneous drip, how to turn him to prevent bed sores, how to measure the remaining days of his life not in sunrises, but in the diminishing light in his eyes. He withered away, his strong body consumed from within, until he was little more than a whisper, a fragile collection of bones under a thin blanket. But in those final, sacred days, a miraculous and heartbreaking thing happened. As his body failed, as it shut down system by system, his spirit seemed to grow lighter, clearer. The wall that the army and the war had built around his soul, the wall that had separated us for so long, began to crumble into dust. One quiet afternoon, he was lucid. The morphine cloud had parted, and his eyes were focused and present, the clearest I had seen them in years. He turned his head on the pillow and looked at me, and he smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. It was a glimpse of my Jack, my real Jack, shining through at the very end. He weakly motioned for my hand, and I gave it to him, his grip surprisingly firm. "Ellie," he said, his voice a dry rustle, but his words clear. "I need you to know something. It's important." "I'm here, my love," I said, leaning closer, my tears already starting to fall. "I'm listening." "I'm sorry," he whispered, and the tears that welled in his own eyes were clean, uncomplicated tears of regret and love, not the tortured tears of PTSD. "I'm so sorry I couldn't give you the forever I promised. I'm sorry I left you so long before this. The army, it took me the day I signed on the dotted line. It just took a while for my body to catch up to the fact that my soul had already mustered out." I brought his hand to my lips, kissing his papery skin. "You came back to me, Jack," I choked out. "In the end, you fought your way back to me. That's all that matters." He gave me that small, sad, beautiful smile. "You were always my true north, Ellie. My fixed point. I just got lost for a while in a desert with no maps. Thank you for never stopping the search." Those were the last real, coherent words he ever spoke to me. He slipped into a coma later that evening and passed away peacefully 2 days later, just as the first rays of the sun were tinting the horizon pink and gold. He took one soft, final breath, and then there was silence. A different kind of silence. Not the fraught, waiting silence of his PTSD, but a deep, absolute, and final silence. The funeral was a full military honors affair. The crisp, dress blue uniforms, the white gloves, the sharp, synchronized 21-gun salute that made me jump every time. The haunting, lonely melody of taps played by a bugler whose notes seemed to hang in the still air forever. A young soldier, his face a mask of solemn duty, knelt before me on one knee, his white-gloved hands presenting me with the tightly folded tri-cornered American flag. "On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your husband's honorable and faithful service." I took the flag. It was heavy, much heavier than it looked, a dense, symbolic weight in my arms. I looked past the young soldier at the rows of uniformed men and women who had come to pay their respects, and I felt a complicated, tangled knot of gratitude and a deep, burning resentment. They were honoring the soldier. They were burying a hero. I was burying my husband. And I had already lost him, long, long before the cancer ever took his last breath. The flag in my arms felt like both a tribute and a receipt for a life that had been spent long before it was over. In the years since, I have slowly, painstakingly, found a kind of peace. It is not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of integration. The sharp, jagged edges of the grief have softened, worn down by time into smooth stones I can carry in my pocket. I still make maps, but my focus has undergone a profound transformation. I no longer map the physical world, with its fixed coastlines and measurable depths. Now, I map the landscapes of memory. I draw the contour lines of his laughter. I chart the rivers of our conversations. I shade in the forests of the quiet, ordinary moments we shared, the lazy Sunday mornings, the arguments over whose turn it was to take out the trash, the way he'd look at me across a crowded room. I am creating a cartography of a love that was, for a time, my entire world, a world more real and vivid than any I could ever draw on paper. The legacy Jack left me is not one of heroic battle stories or patriotic fervor. It is a quieter, more complex, and more human legacy. It is the understanding that love is not a fortress that can withstand any siege, but a delicate, living ecosystem that can be poisoned by unseen toxins. It is the knowledge that the most profound goodbyes are not the dramatic, final ones said at a graveside, but the thousands of little, silent goodbyes that happen in the living room, in the kitchen, in the shared bed, while the person you love is still breathing right next to you. It is the realization that grief is not a single event, but a process that can begin long before the heart stops beating. The moral of my story, the line I would etch into stone, learn not from any atlas or textbook, but from the slow, painful erosion and eventual transformation of my own heart, is this: grief does not begin at the end. It begins at the first moment you realize the person you love is already gone, and you are left alone, loving the beautiful, aching memory of who they used to be. I married a soldier who promised me forever. And the army took him from me, piece by piece, long, long before death ever did.